really, we're returning to the topic of numbers, and all three of you are in that business. So, Tim, I'm going to come to you first.
Oh, God.
And I'm going to, whenever I've spoken to Tim before, he's a very eloquent man, let's put it that way, and he likes to talk. So that's why I'm going to address this question to you first. The simple one. What all three of you do here is you look at numbers and decide whether they're genuine and what their sort of provenance is and so on. Why has it become so difficult to give a definitive answer to the question, who owns this number? What's changed, Tim?
Well, I think it's not really that anything has changed, but I think it's just become more and more important. It's become, everyone is looking for the provenance of a number. What do I know about it? Where should I expect to see it? When should I expect to see it? And therefore, you just want as much information as you can possibly get. But you kind of end up with a hierarchy of ownership of a number. You've got your phone number on your phone. Okay, that belongs to your mobile operator. You may or may not have ported. You've got another number which might actually belong to an MVNO. Okay, so it's not actually the MNO, it's the MVNO that owns that number. It might be used for some sort of call center application, so it belongs to a call center platform. Now that call center platform might be used by 5 different enterprises, so it belongs to an enterprise. No, it actually belongs to a particular campaign which is going on at that time. Now all of those are kind of authentic owners, or they have a reason for interest in that particular number. So that's why I call it a sort of chain of ownership. And being able to understand and see that relationship and being able to track it. Now, the problem is, the systems that are in place today just don't really do that. We do bits of it. You look at what a number portability authority or administrator does. They know roughly, they probably don't know where the MVNO numbers are, but they do know where the MNO numbers are. They know what's fixed. Okay, that's good. But anything more than that, forget it. So we're ending up with sort of a number of registries, and netnumber run a registry, we run a registry, we all have those registries of where those numbers are and what that ownership looks like. So I think that's kind of that complexity that is being introduced, and the need to recognize that who has a right to use that number, and who has a right to make the call at that moment in time. Can you make a call, or should you only receive calls? Again, that's another great one. The US has just introduced do not originate as a particular attribute of a number. Should that number ever originate a call? And if you think of a call center, an inbound call center, a lot of those numbers that belong to an enterprise, a spoofer might hide behind that number. It looks good, but it should never, ever originate an outbound call. So if you can mark it as such, there you are, you've got an attribute, and it's the owner of that number who knows, should it be two-way or should it be one-way? So it's all of those aspects. As you said, I can go on and on and on.
But a lot of it is due to the fact that it's so much easier now, thanks to technology, to issue a new number in a way that perhaps it wasn't 20 years ago, correct?
That's absolutely true. I think that ability to just go onto a website and say, I need a number, which in a way is quite a dangerous thing. The fact you can just request dynamically a virtual number and use it for whatever purposes you choose. So being able to track those things back again, it always comes to who is the rightful owner, who is who has responsibility for that particular number.
So Tim's described how difficult it is to fully determine the provenance of a particular number. So John, how does your company go about tackling that challenge?
Well, some bits of it are easy, right? So 44's UK, 203's London, everyone knows it. It's reasonably straightforward. Where it gets complicated is my number, which is of course super legitimate, might get spoofed or hacked or appear in a kidnapping case or whatever. And, or more simply, might have things that look fraudulent about it or suspicious. So maybe I've changed my device, maybe I've moved my SIM swapped for all sorts of legitimate reasons. Maybe I've moved house. So, lots of the signals that are coming out of telecommunications data can imply fraudulent behavior, but can also have very legitimate use cases behind them. one of the problems with looking at numbers that are constantly seen as fraudulent is, it's as easy as to change a number in a fraud attack. If it was there today, doesn't mean it's there tomorrow. So we do a couple of things a bit deeper. Essentially, one of the things we do is use the apps and APIs from the mobile networks to do KYC checks on the subscriber, essentially. So we do things like ride share, flat share, insurance checks to check that the name and number of the individual currently relates to the device that they see in front of them. And for us, it's about mapping the key pieces on the device against that KYC check. And that's the SIM card, or the IMSI, the phone number, and the IMEI, where possible. And so those sort of checks can provide the assurance that the device looks okay, and then they can provide that, and this is the record that we have associated with it.
Right.
And a lot of the use cases for that are really interesting ones online. So it's all the massive rollout of legal protection for gambling, gaming, pornography, age verification is a super opportunity for the mobile industry to do those types of checks against the device and against the age. So we're doing those types of detailed analysis, either from phone records or actually from other KYC type data as well.
And is netnumber doing a similar sort of, is the way you work with your customers similar to that?
On the one side, yes, obviously. I think all three of us are known for providing phone number intelligence data, starting from, like, was this a phone number that was officially allocated by the regulators to a carrier? That was the first step. And then you get down the chain, right? Okay, like, is that actually, like, being used? Has this been handed over to somebody else? Has this been registered for a use case that we should not be seeing for internal purposes? Has this been lent out to a CPaaS provider for a virtual number or for a CSP, so an enterprise can actually use that, et cetera, et cetera? Is that a consumer number? Was it ported? Like, all of that, we do that, obviously, as well. Something that we do on top of that that's probably standing out is that you said it's actually not nice that you can go online and buy a phone number with a mouse click. I sort of disagree to that point to an extent that during COVID it was extremely important that businesses that were not allowed to do retail could actually take their services and bring them into the mobile channel. And they had no time to build an app, right? They had no time to, like, bring all of their customers to a website. The easiest way was to put just a QR code and say, like this is my number. Like, text me if you want something. Like, I can chat with you immediately. And those businesses, they registered. Like, they created a new presence for their shops, for their businesses in an instant. And that created massive revenues and a massive market, and it was great consumer benefit out of that. Yes, there are downsides, and we addressed them in the earlier panels as well, that you have to, like, vet whoever is doing that, and you have to be able to do that at scale. But that is something that netnumber is providing successfully in the North American market. Like, we allow businesses to take their business phone numbers. Like, if you're a bank or whatever, like, you don't have to go and get a mobile number to do texting. What you can do is you can take your phone number of your call center or, like, your agents with the landlines that are already registered in the mobile phones of your clients and your consumers. So when you send them a text, and we talk about branded texting, like, the information, the phone number, gets immediately replaced by whatever is on the person's phone, right? And for your, like, regular consumer base, like, they have stored your phone number because they are in contact with you. And we allow those companies to use these business phone numbers also for messaging. And at the same time, for the ecosystem, we make sure that these channels are protected. So when you register your phone number, you can make sure that only you can use it and nobody else. And for the consumers, we tell them it's vetted. So the content on it is actually being legitimate.
Right. Okay. Tim, what does this look like from an end user's or an enterprise user perspective? You know, John's talked about how he works with the rental sector, and I'll come back to asking him more about that. But what does it look like? You know, are they testing in real time? Are they presumably they're using APIs that you give them? How does it actually look?
Yeah,
what's
the way the
experience?
companies are consuming this information, using this information. I mean, first of all, it was mentioned earlier on, it's an ecosystem. So it goes all the way from the operator, the MNO or whatever, through the hubs, through the aggregators, through the A2P applications providers, into the CPaaS world, to the enterprise. Now, each of those steps in the ecosystem is asking questions about those numbers, legitimacy, any kind of information about their background, maybe history information on those numbers. So they're probably doing it for different reasons at each step.
Yeah.
But the point is, they all need access to this information. And it tends to be similar information. So that way of having kind of a central repository, a central registry, or a central database of information, which can then be accessed online in real time. And I give one example of this because so much has been talked about artificial traffic inflation. There's one very large retail company, and they check every single number that they're ever asked to either call back or send a message to. And they do that as a real-time query into our global number range database. And what they're finding about, and again, this was asked as a question, what are the stats of that? They found about 10% of the numbers didn't exist. So if someone is asking for a callback to a non-existent number, about 15% of those callbacks were going to premium rate numbers, some form of revenue share premium rate number. So, getting on for 25% of the callback requests that enterprise organization has seen at certain times were probably, not certainly, but probably fraudulent. So it's an excellent example of where you're saying, I'm going to use some really, well, I'll say it's basic information. It's a pain in the neck to maintain, but it's basic information that says, does this number exist? Does it belong to a carrier? Is it being seen in a place that you'd expect to see it? That's it. So it's a real kind of yes-no type answer.
And if there's, what's the volumes like that in that particular organisation's case?
Well, in that particular one, they're doing about 200 million a month.
So what does the user experience look like of 200 million checks? What happens? They just...
So in their particular
case... Is it automated or...?
Yeah, absolutely, completely automated. So they have made the logic within their system make a blocking decision. They will just trash that particular transaction and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to send a message to a non-existent number because I'll probably get charged for it.
And how often is there a false positive there?
There have to be some, but when it's a non-existent number, that's very, very low.
Right.
When you're tracking something like a premium rate number, again, that's a pretty surefire concern for that particular number.
Right.
So really, because you're using what I describe as authoritative data, it's a simple piece of information about that number that is fixed. It's not someone's opinion. It's actually information about how it's been provisioned in the network. And I think that makes a real difference. We sort of divide the data between authoritative, which really is something I've got from a number owner, to the analytic-based, where you're looking at the behavior of the number, and then you're going on to subjective measurements, which are more about looking at whether someone has reported third-party data, whether an issue has been reported with the number. So sort of treating those three as data sets, which you're then in a position to make decisions based upon, you're getting to a point where you can make those really, really fast, instantaneous go, no-go decisions on a transaction.
John, tell us more about the use cases that you're working with.
Yeah, just to re-emphasize Tim's point, it's great to have a simple product. Similar sort of numbers, 20-25% of checks against likely fraudulent numbers for us don't exist. So, that's a very easy place to start.
Yeah.
And that's not just retail, that's also in telecommunications world. Networks and aggregators tend not to check always or very well. So it's very simple stuff that's possible. The great thing, though, about, as Tim says, and some of the complexity, is as you look at the richer data. So the mobile API is now a really good example, a really good first sort of step of making their CRM data available to the world. The next step of that is, of course, to then analyze the data that they have to deduce the likelihood of risk. And if the networks are prepared to think about their data in terms of the likelihood of risk, then that can be very, very useful data for retail. So it doesn't necessarily mean subscribers don't get services, but maybe a certain subscriber who looks enormously risky has to authenticate themselves in a different or higher friction way. And so I think how telecommunications data is regulated, how it's shared, and how it's analysed to deduce risk is a major legal issue, at the minute. And how that develops can really improve the capability of people like us to understand and protect retail. Things like credit cards and one-time passwords is the most obvious use case.
Give us an example then of how a number, the behaviour of a number rather than the origin of it, can indicate a higher risk.
Well, so really simple examples like the flash calling stuff at the moment, you can see very simply from analysing a lot of data the types of numbers that are generating significant amounts of the flash calls, simply because the fraudsters, if they're fraudsters, can do it.
Yeah.
So they don't have to mask it in a complicated way or spoof numbers in a very complicated way. They just get some and then blast all the calls out from those numbers. So actually, there's some very simple ways to analyse numbers. And then the more complicated ones, if you think IP addresses, right? Dark web. What data is available on the dark web about IP addresses that have been performing dubious activity? Exactly the same thing, issues for telephone numbers or passwords, and could be used in a firewall to protect customers. Tends not to be at the moment because, of course, for my problem earlier, maybe my number was spoofed and got on the dark web. Doesn't mean I'm a bad subscriber and I shouldn't be cut off from anything. But how that balance of analysing telecoms data to improve fraud services is a real challenge. And I think we're seeing it go the opposite way, right? We're seeing the ICO take out cases in various countries against the sharing of data. So it's a tricky one. We'll see what happens.
Marco, which verticals are you getting the most demand from for your services, and where do you see the growth coming from?
Oh, that certainly depends on the use case, right? I would say the plurality of verticals have one thing in common, that is reduce their cost, right? And that cost can either come from, I have too many services, I use services to like phone numbers that are actually not legitimate, so I can just like stop using those services. And that can range from CPaaS providers, aggregators, voice wholesalers, carriers, but also like CRM providers, marketing companies, whatever you might think of, right? And then the other thing is that is cost motivated is the damage that is being done if fraud occurs in your name. Like it's the damage to the brand, it's the actual incident where you have to potentially like repay whatever money was stolen, if you want to do that, for example, banks, financial institutions, etc. So to those verticals, it is extremely important to get highly accurate data. Another big problem where financial implications are rather big is artificially inflated traffic, right? And the headline of this is, are data analytics and intelligence-driven approaches enough to stop fraud, right? I would certainly say, like, unless it stops, we haven't done enough. So we always have to go on. But data analytics and getting the most information for phone numbers is an extremely important basis to do whatever you want to do, right? To detect artificially inflated traffic, you need to make sure that you can actually detect the destinations that are being exploited. So you need to be able to create dashboards that show you these MVNOs, these number providers are actually currently being targeted because I see an increase, which is not statistical, it's a systematic increase. So I can act here. And that's one thing of the stuff that we're doing for banks, carriers, communication, marketing, credit score companies, and so on. But the other thing is, and I mentioned that earlier, is that data is so vast. Like, is data enough? It always depends on how much data you have, right? So if you combine phone numbers not only with like who is sending, but also combine it with the intent, and that's also being something that is being done by the campaign registry, who actually ask, like, what is it that you're doing with the phone numbers? What is the campaign? What's your intent? Shortcodes have that concept as well, like, what's the campaign? And we combine that information to the phone number. So if carriers come to us and say, like, I see this phone number, we also tell them what this phone number is supposed to be doing. So they can much better analyze if that what they're seeing is in line with what is expected. And I think that is a big leap forward in using phone number intelligence data to prevent fraud.
How do you handle the scale of that, though? If you're trying to establish what the intent of the message is, and there's millions of messages, how do you cope with that?
Yeah. There are two factors to it, right? One, the scale is the complexity of everybody has a different understanding and different policies, right? Every mobile operator that you talk to, a network provider, has a different policy as to how they would like to police their network. Some are saying, I only need to know whether it's business or not. Others say, I need to know whether the entity behind it is political or what the vertical of the entity is. And that's a big complexity, and there are partners. Like, these are challenges for the vetting that is the Aegis is doing and working together with the mobile operators to say, like, what are the different classifications that you would like us to populate and register. And then the other big part of it is the technical difficulty to distribute that at scale, right? So we're talking here about real-time analysis, as well as, like, after the fact, like, there have been complaints, or I just have a lot of statistics, like last month's data, and I want to analyze those. These are completely different problems, and they need different technical solutions. But on real time, it's really having a platform that is capable of answering these things in real time. So combining hundreds of data sets, replying in milliseconds for 10,000s of requests, like, that's actually needed if you want to, like, do good decisions in the message chain, in the message flow.
Okay, well, we're running up to the end of the session. I'm going to ask Tim one last question, which is, what sort of, looking ahead to the future, how do you see your business changing, and what new technologies or innovations might impact you, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of these have been talked about today, where you're looking at some of the authentication methods end-to-end across the network, and it's bringing together those aspects of an ecosystem where you're really trying to make sure that every point along the path has got what they need, has got the information that they need to be able to make good decisions. Is it good application? Is it exactly as we've just been hearing about, looking at the application type as well as the basic information about the numbers and who they're owned by. And, this is just a continuing requirement. It's a conversation you and I have had.
Yeah.
Telephone numbers are not going to go away. They're still that unique, uniform identifier that is actually global. It's one of the very, very few things that really has a true global standardization that allows us to say this is going to be used as an identifier for both origin and destination for many, many years to come. So by adding more intelligence and associating it with that identity, I think we can take that further. So when you look at those innovations, it does come down to more attributes, more information. I think we've also heard a lot about information sharing. And I think there's some real huge industry challenges about information sharing. I mean, I am running into operators who are saying, well, I've got this information about fraud, which I want to make available to an ecosystem who are connecting to me, but I can't actually do that because that's not the reason I have that data. In other words, the purpose that I've been provided with that data is not for fraud management. And you might say, no, that's legitimate interest. Everyone sort of copes with this idea of legitimate interest. But then we're seeing telecom, a review of some of the telecoms regulations are saying, I don't care, you still can't share it. So I think overcoming some of those barriers that were put in place to resolve privacy concerns, but recognizing there are times when you really, really do need to share information about those numbers to be able to protect your subscriber. So they're actually counterproductive right now in certain circumstances. So I think those are the developments that I think are going to move on. Data sharing, more attributes, broader distribution of the information to all of the elements that need to know.
Well, that's a beautiful answer, Tim, because the next panel session is all about regulatory frameworks and questions of around legal issues around data.
Set them up with a
so
question.
You've set us up beautifully. I've been told that we're going to, if you have any questions, you can ask these guys at the networking session later. So with that, I will say thank you to John, to Tim, and to Marco. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.